Hey associates. All right, so this video lecture is just going to go over some of that foundational information intro and just my tips for beginning a research project, especially as these research reports and formal reports show up a little bit differently than the research that you might have done in more of like an essay or argument forming course. And definitely as technical writers, that's usually going to come in the form of something like a recommendation report. So we're doing this research to ultimately help recommend an action or a feasibility study to ultimately find out what is the most feasible path or is this solution feasible. Or you might come up with things like white papers that again have some nuance, have rigor, are very deliberate to ultimately introduce kind of a new process or product to stakeholders and the market. So what are sort of the intersecting, intricate details, rigor, right? How are our standards really clear and transparent and something somebody else could replicate and really understand the logic and validity behind, and then deliberate. We're making very clear choices, and that deliberate, those intentional choices come down into things like our paradigm and our research questions and the methods that we choose. And so a paradigm, right, at this intro level, the thing that you need to know going into your research is that we all kind of exist sort of in a cave. You might have heard of Plato's allegory of the cave. Basically, right, the cave is the boundary of our knowledge, and depending sort of where you are situated in the cave, it makes a difference on what you actually see and are able to know. And so somebody sort of in the depths and the dark of the cave, and that's kind of all they've ever been, have a certain point of view. And then as you start to come out of the cave and see the rest of the world, right, you enter a new paradigm where the boundaries of your knowledge are kind of pushed. And so our paradigm, the sort of entry point for our research, is kind of what does our cave look like? What do we notice? What are we able to see within our own caves? Cool, cool, cool. We do think we can like figure out reality. Like there is a single thing happening and we're going to figure out what it is, but we recognize there's some limits, right? Whether human error, the instruments that we have, the tech we have, like there's always going to be limits on the knowledge. Now we might continue to expand, and our goal is to expand the boundaries of our knowledge, but there are going to be limits. So that's kind of the first big one. The second big one, critical. I'm a big fan of this. This is where my research typically lands. And in it, basically, the our cave says, hey, there's like a reality out there, but it's always going to be obstructed by our power structures and our social dynamics and our situation. And so if you are hanging out in kind of that critical paradigm, that critical cave, a lot of the research kind of gets focused on, let me kind of figure out how our power structures and how people are keeping other people from sort of this idea of like truth. And truth is really focused on interrogating kind of those dynamics between people. And then last is the constructivist is another big one you might pay attention to. This one's really gaining popularity because it's basically like, hey, what is true reality, right? The truth is always going to be relative to who we are and our position, and it kind of combines, I think, a really nice way of like critical, recognizing everyone's position and their truth, right? It's going to depend on where they basically are situated amongst other people, and opens things up for a lot more interpretation. And so they aren't, sometimes they're set up in like tension with each other, but really we need researchers coming at the same kind of situation from all three paradigms to really actually understand and really push kind of the boundary of what's going on. First, we usually start with theory, and the theory is kind of, you might have learned it maybe in high school or whatever, as kind of a best guess at something. That's not really what theory is. Theory is actually the current explanation we have that frames, right, the knowledge and explains what's going on. And so theories are used to like unpack situations. Theory is used to set up kind of research and studies and questions, but it's not necessarily something that has to be like proved or disproved, right? At this higher order in this field, it really is more of a framework for studying something, and it offers a framework to try and explain what's going on. So we'll start with like our theory, and then based on the theory that you have, you can come up with the method. So, okay, how are you now going to, right, use this framework to actually study the thing that you're interested in? And ultimately, you come up with some conclusions. Now, all of these gears are interconnected because you can sometimes start with more of a conclusion. Be like, I observed this, and here's what I think's happening. And then that kind of turns the cog into the theory, right? And then we're like, okay, we keep observing this. Let's build a theory out of it. You got your paradigm kind of in order. Um, and you're starting to think about, okay, what is the research? So now we got to get into research questions. Here's the thing. A question needs to be really specific and it needs to be answerable through this, nuanced, rigorous, intentional investigation. So if Tina was like in our class, was learning to be a technical writer, had to, create a formal report that was going to really help, extend knowledge, be usable for the field. Maybe instead of asking if you think horses get songs stuck in their head, or she change it into something like, how does noise pollution impact wildlife in rural areas? We could even say agricultural, areas or agricultural animals, if she wanted to really focus on horses. But really, it's noise pollution. This is an issue that is, starting to expand out, and we have the actual impacts, right? And we can measure and we can assess and we can, uh, you know, have that systematic observation of the impacts on, right, the wildlife, and now in this very specific area. So go from a yes, no, that's a fun question, into a usable, now this comes up with different solutions and challenges and things that we can do about it for better questions. All right, what about this one, right? So we could start with, do residents like the new trailhead? Okay, one way that we could definitely quickly fix this is to instead think about, how does the new trailhead impact traffic, wildlife sightings, and property values, right? So again, this time we're going from kind of like a yes or no type of question, which not a cool, great, extending, nuanced, rigorous, intentional report makes. Nope, nope. But now we can say, okay, we're still focused on, right, this new trailhead, but now we want to specifically, right, look at traffic impacts. We want to look at wildlife, and we want to look at property values, right? And now we have three really great kind of criteria and research points that we're now bringing knowledge together to ultimately answer a question that people could maybe do something about, right? If we know the impact on traffic, we could then deliver that to, the right people, the city, and maybe they think about different roads, structures, or parking lots, right? If we have information on wildlife sightings and the impacts there, right, you could deliver that to the Parks Department. Property values, right, that could be delivered and acted on way more than just a, hey, do you like it? Yeah, sure, maybe, I don't know. So think about adding some measures. This was a research question that I did, I guess, in grad school, and actually got to present it at a national conference, which was pretty cool, pretty interesting. But my initial question, right, I just started out, and you can start by just asking a question. So my question was, what are people saying about the Black Panther movie? And I was super excited about it. I kind of thought, like I wonder what people are saying. Right? So I started with a basic question, and then I turned that basic question and just interest area into a research question. And I did that by focusing, okay, civic discourse, right? That was a area of literature, right, that I was really into. And then I was like, let's focus on race and sociopolitics, specifically. So it's not just what are they saying, but what are they saying about these really, impactful topics? Especially, this originally came out in like 2018, 19, so especially important then. And online comments, right? So instead of just like, what are people saying? Now it's like, okay, I have a place I can go to. Online comments, that's what I'm going to look at. Now I have direction for like my methods. What am I actually looking at? race and sociopolitics, like how people talking about race and, politics when they're commenting on reviews to like this movie or they're talking about right this movie. And then the civic discourse gives me some of that theory. Turn a basic question into a research question by thinking about what is it actually that you want to explain, how is it going to extend our understanding of the world, and what kind of paradigm might you be coming through. And so just kind of the difference, and especially for technical writers, how you might fall or use some of these. And it is definitely more and more common and more important and ultimately valuable for researchers to use what we call mixed methods, which is just you have some qualitative stuff, you have some quantitative stuff, and it helps you understand kind of that situation a little bit better. So qualitative, right? A lot of people are like, it's words. Sure, I guess. I mean, you're going to be writing a lot, whether you're qualitative or quantitative. It just depends where the writing lands. But qualitative, think of it as expressing an understanding of human actions. And again, we're focused on really deep, small samples usually because we want to really explain and understand like what humans more are doing there. Quantitative is usually expressing a situation numerically. So that's where it is much more of like numbers bound, if you will. But it is less about sort of expressing what's happening in terms of like describing it and making these like inferences and stories and like unpacking it. And it's much more of like, here's how the numbers play out. And so in that way, it's a lot more on breadth of understanding to try to generalize like and predict behavior. Qualitative can still help predict behavior, and quantitative can definitely still help us understand human action. That's why mixed methods is really great, and we need both of them. But when you're like, what's the difference? You kind of think of it as like, do you want a really deep understanding of like explaining human actions, or do you want more of like a breadth to kind of try and predict and generalize the situation? Qualitative, typically, right? Critical and constructivists are going to use qualitative because we want to like figure out what is like happening that numbers can't quite show you. Whereas quantitative tends to be more suited for post-positive work where it's like there is a truth and the numbers show us the truth and this is the state of the situation that we're going to go with. So again, do you want to just understand like here is the situation, or do you want to really like pick at and unpack and explore the situation from different angles? Some of the methods: interviews, case studies, textual analyses, all of those are really common. Quantitative, it's going to be more surveys, especially if you don't have a lot of open-ended questions, but it's more of like on a scale of 1 to 5. Manipulations, experiments, I mean, those are pretty classic. And then any kind of statistical or content analysis. Again, it more or less they fall into these categories, but you could definitely do one mixed method, which would be great. Have a survey that has both that kind of quant data, and then you dive really deep into some of the open-ended themes, and then maybe you follow up with an interview, that kind of thing. All work really, really well. So don't get too caught up into which one. Instead, it's more important to get caught up and really think about what is going to be the best for your research questions. And as we kind of start to wrap up, research ethics, can't forget our ethics that are going to be coming into play, especially, and no matter what, qualitative, quantitative, post-positivist, critical, constructivist, we all have to follow some ethics. So with experiments, especially, we're worried about mental and physical harm. They should do, make sure people know what's going on, that they are going to feel, ultimately safe, that you have a really good debrief with them. And if you are kind of pushing into more taboo, sort of dark, scary, gray area research, that you have things like counseling, for them available right away so they can kind of unpack what just happened. One of the biggest things with Tuskegee that is an absolute no-no, again, they didn't have even informed consent. They didn't really explain what they were going to do or tell the participants and the patients what was happening, or, give them the option for the treatment later. They just kind of tested on them and didn't really tell them what was going on, and kind of under some false pretenses. So with your experiments, reduce mental physical harm, be good to your participants and make sure that they are okay and that you're doing right by them and their humanity. Ethics come into play here. We don't want to have leading questions and we want to reserve judgment. So basically that means, don't ask them, isn't X, terrible for the environment? That's a very leading question because somebody's going to be like, yes, yes, it is. Instead, you just ask, like, what are your thoughts on X, as it relates to the environment, right? Give people the space to answer as they actually feel, and then reserve any judgments, especially if you're doing like an interview. You gotta, have that good poker face and try not to react too much, because then that will kind of ruin the rest of your interview or your questions and change the dynamic. Also keep the identity of your sample protected, right? We don't want to be putting everybody's responses out on blast here. And then when it comes to textual analysis, so that's where you are looking at sort of documents or items or just kind of like observations for your key research. The main thing is just that you have really clear standards for your evaluation. I mean, you would do that anyway because our research, right? You wanted to have that rigor. People should be able to replicate it and understand, but especially on a textual analysis where it is kind of you um, unpacking and analyzing this thing sort of yourself, or maybe you have, a team that can do that, and that certainly helps and help you with it. Just make sure you have really strong justifications for, why you are coming up with these findings and these results, and make sure that your inferences are just reasonable, just meaning like somebody else could look at them and be like, oh yeah, like I totally see where you're coming from with that. Or I definitely could, following the same methods, the same sort of standards that you followed, get to a very similar conclusion as well. Basically, you just don't want to be like coming in out of left field because that's what you think the answer is, when actually the text, the observations, the subject, the data isn't really giving you those vibes. Most jobs want people who can, right, evaluate stuff, demonstrate analytical thinking, reasoning skills. All of that comes into being able to have good, research that is, going to be nuanced, going to be rigorous, going to have like a deliberateness to it, some good intention. And so, this research report, this project can be one of those concrete examples. I used to be like, yeah, I actually had to do a really intense, kind of long, formal report, and I had to use all of these research skills. And here's the question I came up with, and the paradigm that I use, and here's why the methods are going to work for it. And this can be one of those places you demonstrate that you have, right? Some of this like reasoning skill, right? You demonstrate, right, that you are able to evaluate things like options, and be able to move forward. And last, it all goes back to effective writing. You're doing all this research and work, and you're going to put it in a formal report so that way people can use it and do something with the content. So just remember, we have basically 3 steps for effective writing, no matter what, as technical writers that we've talked about. First, we want to be very clear, right? Be appropriate with the jargon, right? You don't always have to use like the most hoity-toity word. Like, use appropriate jargon, and if you do use things, think about explaining it in a glossary for folks who might not know that word. Make sure you have good background context, that you like put what needs to be put in the report so somebody can understand where you're coming from, and make sure you have appropriate graphics as well. All right, and we think about our data visuals and that we're choosing, right, the best visual that isn't going to obscure the situation. Second, be organized. Also goes back to that taxonomy. We love it. Use your headings, bullet points, font choices, all of that to help your reader find the information. These reports are long. They tend to be a little bit dense, but people need it to do an action, understand the world better, make decisions for their company. So make sure that it is really nice and organized, and clear to follow. And then last, be accurate. Duh. Like, effective writing is going to be correct and accurate. And so use your analytical, reasoning, research skills, tell us the truth, be helpful, right? The point here is not to necessarily persuade or prove your argument like in more of like a rhetorical essay, right? You don't have a thesis that you're trying to like, yes, I need to prove this right. It's not an argument, right? It's let me do this research and answer this question so that way we can move forward with the correct actions. So you need to be truthful and helpful in the information that you report out so that way we can move forward with the correct actions. And with that, you'll be off to the races with your research and your project. Thanks, associate. Bye. All right, so